Somewhere in the North Pacific in the early spring of 1968, a submarine carrying nearly 100 sailors and 3 nuclear-armed missiles simply stopped talking. No distress call, no debris, no wreckage washing up anywhere. The Soviet Navy searched an enormous stretch of ocean and found nothing at all. Months later, American intelligence believed it had found something the Soviet Navy never could. How do you lose a nuclear submarine so completely that its own Navy can't find it? How does another country even begin looking for something hidden beneath 5 kilometers of water? And why would anyone consider that broken wreck one of the most valuable objects on the entire ocean floor? Stay with me, because this isn't a story where the answers arrive all at once. It's a story where every answer creates another question. Let's start with what's actually known. The submarine was called K-129, a Soviet Golf II class ballistic missile boat, diesel-electric, built in the late 1950s and stationed at Rybazhi, a submarine base on the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia's Far East. It wasn't built to patrol quietly and come home. It was built to carry 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles into position in the Pacific, ready to launch if the Cold War ever turned hot. A vessel like this didn't just represent a crew and a hull. It represented a live nuclear threat, and Moscow needed to always know exactly where that threat was sitting. That is what made losing track of it so much more than an accident. It wasn't just a missing ship, it was a missing weapon. K-129 ran on diesel engines and batteries, not a nuclear reactor, which meant it had to surface or come close to the surface regularly to recharge, breathing air the way older submarines always had to. There was no way to stay in constant contact from underwater, so the entire system depended on something almost old-fashioned: scheduled radio check-ins at set points along the patrol route, so command back on land would know the submarine was still out there. On February 24, 1968, K-129 left port under the command of Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzar, heading out for what was meant to be a routine deterrent patrol. It dove for a test run, resurfaced, radioed back that everything was normal, and continued on its way. Then, according to the plan, it was supposed to check in again as it crossed the 181st meridian, roughly the halfway point of the Pacific. That check-in never came. One missed transmission on its own wasn't necessarily alarming. Radios failed, antennas failed, but then the submarine missed its second expected check-in too, the one confirming it had reached its patrol station. And that is when a routine delay started to look like something else entirely. But knowing something was wrong and knowing where to look were 2 completely different problems. By mid-March, commanders in Kamchatka were worried enough to act. The Soviet Pacific Fleet launched a massive search, deploying ships and aircraft across a wide stretch of the North Pacific, looking for any sign of K-129, an oil slick, a piece of debris, a life raft, anything at all. They found nothing. To understand why, you have to understand what they were actually up against. The likely search zone stretched across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open ocean, water that, in places, ran nearly 5 kilometers deep. Radio signals don't travel through seawater the way they travel through air. Sonar only reaches so far before the signal scatters and fades. And in 1968, huge sections of the Pacific seafloor had never been properly mapped at all. Searching for a single submarine down there wasn't like finding a lost car on a map. It was closer to searching an entire mountain range at night, from several kilometers above it, with no idea which valley to even begin checking. By the end of March, the Soviet Navy quietly called off the search. K-129 and her crew were declared lost. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. The Soviets had been searching where any navy in the world would instinctively search, on the surface, scanning the water for wreckage. What they didn't know was that the United States had been listening beneath it the entire time, The U.S. Navy operated a network of underwater hydrophone arrays known as SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, built to track the engine noise of Soviet submarines as they moved through the ocean. On March 8, 1968, several of those listening stations, spread from Alaska down the American West Coast, picked up something unusual. Not the steady hum of an engine. A single, sharp, violent acoustic event, something analysts later described as an isolated, powerful bang, arriving at different stations at slightly different times. That sound didn't arrive labeled. It didn't announce a submarine's name, or its nationality, or its fate. It was simply an event, recorded on tape, and it was up to a group of analysts to figure out what it actually meant. They compared the exact arrival time of the signal at each separate station. From those tiny differences in timing, measured in fractions of a second, they could estimate a rough bearing from each site. Where those bearings crossed gave them a probable location. They cross-referenced that location against what was known about Soviet submarine movements in the region, and against the fact that a Soviet Gulf-class boat had gone quiet in roughly that part of the Pacific around the same date. Only after all of that did anyone seriously consider sending a search vessel out to look. This wasn't a machine identifying a wreck. It was a slow, careful process of elimination, run by people, deciding piece by piece whether a single strange noise recorded weeks earlier might actually be the sound of a submarine's final moment. The acoustic evidence dramatically narrowed the search area, from something like the entire North Pacific down to a patch of ocean that, while still enormous, was at least searchable. But narrowing a search area is not the same as finding a wreck. Even with that estimate in hand, American searchers were still facing something comparable to combing an entire metropolitan region, block by block, lying beneath nearly 5 kilometers of water, in total darkness. In mid-1968, the U.S. Navy sent the submarine USS Halibut, specially converted for deep-sea search work, out toward that stretch of ocean on a classified mission. Halibut towed behind it a piece of equipment nicknamed the Fish, a deep-towed camera and sonar sled built to withstand extreme pressure and photograph the sea floor from close range. Think about what that search actually required. Nearly 5 kilometers of black water between the surface and the seabed, colder and darker than almost anywhere sunlight has ever reached. The Fish had to be towed carefully, close enough to the bottom to photograph anything useful, but far enough above the terrain to avoid slamming into an undersea ridge or getting lost in the mud. At any given moment, it could only see a narrow strip of ocean floor directly beneath it, which meant sweeping back and forth across the search zone for weeks, pass after pass, using little more than 1960s film cameras and sonar. But there was another problem underneath all of this. Nobody could be entirely certain the acoustic event they were chasing was even K129. It was the strongest lead anyone had. It wasn't a guarantee. Then, in early August 1968, after weeks of methodical passes, the images coming back from the Fish started to change. At first, there was nothing unusual. Mud, low ridges, scattered rock, the ordinary texture of an unmapped seafloor. Another pass, more of the same. And then, in one frame, something that didn't belong. A straight edge where the terrain should have curved naturally. Another pass, closer this time. An angle that didn't occur in nature. Then curved metal, unmistakably shaped, unmistakably built by hands rather than carved by geology. Somewhere in a room full of analysts studying those photographs as they came in, the realization spread slowly rather than all at once. This wasn't a rock formation. This wasn't a trick of the sonar. It was a hull. It was K129. Halibut spent the following weeks photographing the wreck in extraordinary detail, reportedly capturing more than 20,000 images. The submarine had broken into at least 2 major sections, lying relatively close together on the seabed, nearly 5 kilometers below the surface, roughly 1,600 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii, in water deeper than the wreck of the Titanic. For American intelligence, this was an extraordinary achievement, the product of acoustic analysts, engineers who had adapted a submarine for a job it was never originally built for, and photographic interpreters willing to sit through frame after frame of empty mud until something finally didn't belong. Hundreds of specialists, each one solving a small piece of a puzzle none of them could see the whole of. But it's worth pausing here for a moment, because it matters. Every one of those 20,000 photographs, every intelligence report written about them, every engineering conversation that followed, was also, quietly, documenting a grave. Nearly 100 sailors had gone to sea on what was supposed to be an ordinary patrol and never came home. Whatever happened next in this story, that fact never stopped being true, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. Finding the wreck didn't close the case. It opened a much bigger question. What, if anything, was actually still down there? A Cold War ballistic missile submarine like K-129 could plausibly still hold things American intelligence had never had direct access to before. Officials hoped, at least, that the wreck might still contain its nuclear warheads and missile hardware, cryptographic equipment and code materials that could reveal how Soviet submarines communicated with Moscow, and physical evidence of how the Soviet Union actually engineered its underwater deterrent. But hope and confirmation were two very different things. Nobody on the American side actually knew, from a handful of photographs, what condition any of that material was in after sinking nearly 5 kilometers, breaking into pieces, and sitting on the ocean floor for months. What lay inside that wreck could be worth more than the submarine itself, or it could already be ruined beyond any use. There was only one way to actually find out, and it wasn't going to come from more photographs. There is still no fully settled answer for why K-129 sank in the first place, and it's worth being honest about which explanations actually hold up. The official Soviet position pointed to an accident involving the submarine's snorkel system, the mechanism that let it draw air while running just beneath the surface, possibly combined with a battery malfunction. It's a plausible mechanical failure, the kind that had happened to other submarines of similar design. But it doesn't obviously explain the sharp, violent character of the acoustic signal SOSUS recorded, which sounded far more like a sudden explosion than a slow flooding accident. American assessments leaned toward exactly that. Some kind of catastrophic internal explosion, though whether it originated from battery gases, a missile-related malfunction, or something else was never conclusively proven from photographs alone. There is also a third explanation, one that some Soviet naval officers believed for the rest of their lives, that K-129 collided with an American submarine shadowing it, most often pointing to USS Swordfish, which was operating in the region around the same time. This is the weakest of the three theories. American officials maintained Swordfish had been operating well away from the area and had sustained only minor damage consistent with ice, not the kind of impact that could breach another submarine's pressure hull. The evidence available today leans against the collision theory, but it has never been fully closed out either. What actually happened to K-129 remains, honestly, one of the open mysteries of the Cold War. What isn't a mystery is what the discovery set in motion. Finding K-129 had taken months of listening, narrowing, searching, and towing a camera sled through total darkness. Reaching it looked, on paper, close to impossible. American officials were looking at a broken submarine sitting under nearly 5 kilometers of water, deeper than any salvage operation in history had ever attempted, and they decided to try anyway. They weren't planning to photograph history. They were planning to lift it off the bottom of the Pacific. That would require a purpose-built ship, a cover story elaborate enough to survive public scrutiny, and a level of engineering ambition that bordered on science fiction for its era, eventually involving a vessel built with backing from Howard Hughes and a supposed deep-sea mining operation. That operation has a name of its own, and it deserves its own telling. The submarine had vanished in silence. Its discovery remained secret for decades, and finding K-129 wasn't the ending of the story. It was only the beginning of one of the boldest engineering operations the Cold War ever produced, one that started with a single photograph of curved metal, lying quietly in the dark, 3 miles beneath the waves. Like and subscribe for more fascinating story from deep ocean.